Please welcome to the stage AGU President-elect Brandon Jones.
Welcome to day 2 of AGU24 and What's Next for Science. Each year, our Frontiers in Geophysics lecture explores new ways of looking at and addressing our most challenging issues. In a moment, our stage will be shared by several people who did just that. As we all know, climate change requires urgent action. AGU remains firm in our position on climate mitigation. Comprehensive actions to limit and adapt to human-caused climate change are urgently needed to protect current, future life on Earth and promote well-being, global equity, and security. But we also know the scientific community is increasingly investigating climate intervention methods. There is still so much we don't know about the risk and efficacy. And to that end, AGU recently released the Ethical Framework Principles for Climate Intervention Research. AGU developed the framework principles in a process spanning more than 2 years, a process that included an open public comment period and contributions from a global board of scientists, policymakers, ethicists, government agencies, non-governmental organizations, and indigenous communities. The consultation included members of academia and representatives from 45 countries, 15 intergovernmental organizations, and 80 non-governmental organizations. So many people worked tirelessly to bring this critical report to reality. On behalf of the AGU leadership, I want to personally thank everyone for their diligence and dedication to the project. For our discussion today, we are joined by members of the Ethical Framework Advisory Board, contributors to the report, and other experts in the field of climate interventions to discuss not just the ethical framework, but more broadly, navigating a more inclusive path. Now, please welcome them all along with our moderator for today's discussion, AGU Interim Executive Director and CEO, Janice LaChance.
Thank you so much, Brandon. And as Brandon mentioned, this has been a 2+ year collaborative effort with a global panel of experts in climate science, technology, ethics, and policy. We published this report in October, and the framework works as a valuable resource to support governments, researchers, NGOs, and the private sector in making responsible decisions regarding climate intervention research and policy. It outlines guiding principles and key steps to consider, offering a structured approach for thoughtful, ethical engagement. Now, for just a bit of context, climate interventions, also known as geoengineering or climate engineering, are deliberate, large-scale attempts to alter the climate system in a way that halts, slows, or reverses global warming. Climate intervention technologies and methods include carbon dioxide removal, which aims to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and store them, solar radiation modification, which aims to reduce the amount of solar radiation absorbed by the Earth, and emerging technologies and research that aim to preserve ice sheets and restore sea ice and permafrost. These technologies continue to draw global attention. In fact, just yesterday, the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism cautioned that solar radiation modification technologies are not sufficiently mature to allow for their safe deployment, and they recommended that research on SRM must be conducted ethically. And this is where the ethical framework can come in. which puts forth 5 key principles. They are responsible research, climate justice, inclusive public participation, transparency, and informed governance. Now, you can see more detailed descriptions on slides as they come up during our talk. This framework draws heavily from ethical precedents that have been developed for biomedical research and genetic engineering, fields where the stakes for humanity and the environment are profound. It also builds on early guiding principles specific to climate intervention, such as the Oxford Principles, the Asilomar recommendations, and the Tollgate Principles. As I said, our ethical framework is not only grounded in science, but also heavily informed by the global community. So let's hear from some of that incredibly dedicated community joining me now for this conversation. Please welcome our panel for today's discussion. And we're so fortunate to have colleagues joining us online. So you all look great on these big giant screens. You look awesome. So thank you for being with us. And what I'd like to do is ask each panelist to think about a quick introduction of themselves so the audience knows exactly the level of talent and expertise that's sharing this stage with me. So let's start with our virtual guests. Nana Ama Brown-Klutzi from the University of Ghana. Nana, can you go ahead and introduce yourself very quickly?
Sure. Thank you. Nice to see you again, Janice.
It's nice to see you too.
In AGU. Yes, so I'm Nana Ama Brown-Klutzi. I'm a professor at the University of Ghana. I also serve as the head of physics department at the university. And I'm currently a vice chair for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the 7th assessment cycle. My research is on climatology. I do climate research, and Bruce up there was my supervisor in my PhD. And recently, I'm working on solar radiation modification research that is supported by the Degrees Initiative. I contributed as a lead author in the IPCC Self-Assessment Report, and that is when I appreciated more of the devastating impact of global warming. I believe that the potential solution to cooling the Earth with immediate effect is through the climate interventions we're talking about. I am, at this point, very much worried also about the fact that we do not have enough knowledge on the potential unintended impact climate intervention can bring. I believe the way around this is to do research, to do more research to improve our knowledge and decisions before we do the implementation or deployment. Thank you very much for having me on the panel.
Right. Thank you, Nana. Marion Herdequin is with Colorado College, and she's joining us from a little bit closer than Nana is. Marion, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, yes, and thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. My background is in philosophy. I'm a professor of philosophy here. I also teach in the environmental studies program. I've been interested in this topic of climate intervention since the early 2000s, particularly with the 2009 Royal Society report, Geoengineering the Climate. I started doing some research on this topic, especially related to questions of multidimensional justice in relation to climate intervention research and development, thinking about the importance of a diverse research community and inclusive engagement, and also thinking about relationships between climate intervention, research, and other climate responses. I've been also involved a bit in sort of the governance space in various ways. I served as a member of the National Academy's committee that produced the 2021 report Reflecting Sunlight, and I've also been a participant in the ethical advisory board for this AGU ethical framework.
Thank you so much, Marion. And now to the folks who are with me here on stage. Margaret Leinen is from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, and more importantly, a past president of AGU. Margaret?
Thank you, Janice. So Margaret Leinen from Scripps Oceanography. I am a professor of oceanography. My specialty is biogeochemistry. And I was fortunate early in my career to be part of the group that started looking at the impact of iron on productivity in the ocean with John Martin and Bob Deuce and Peter Liss and others. And my role was looking at the delivery of soluble iron to the ocean from atmospheric dust. That got me interested in what John had to say about the idea of using something like this as a tool for reducing CO2. And later in my career, I actually got funded the Asilomar Conference on Ethical Principles for Climate Engineering. And that group really took off from some of the work that had been done by the group that developed the Oxford Principles. And also I worked with the IMO that was looking at regulating experiments of all kinds in the ocean. So it was a pleasure to see AGU take up this really important issue of ethical principles if we are going to do research.
Thank you, Margaret. Let's turn to Alan Roebuck from Rutgers University.
Thanks very much. In 2005 at the fall AGU meeting, people were walking in the halls and said, "Did you hear about the paper that Paul wrote?" And it turned out Paul Crutzen had written this paper saying we ought to study geoengineering because he didn't see any mitigation going on. And that fall, next year, 2006, I went to a conference at NASA Ames for 2 days, and there were some people standing up saying what a great idea this was. Mainly they were engineers and physicists. And I started writing down some reasons why it might not be such a good idea. And I published this paper, 20 Reasons Why Stratospheric Geoengineering Might Not Be Such a Good Idea. Up on the screen is my latest list. It has 28 reasons. And the ones and some reasons why you might want to do it, because if you could do it, which you can't today, you would reduce global warming. The ones in black are ones that can be tested with climate modeling or observations of volcanic eruptions, but the ones on the right are ethical and governance issues, which I don't quite know how to solve. And so those are the important things that really have to be addressed before we can make an informed decision about whether or not to do this in the future once we get the technology. I founded the Geoengineering Model and Comparison Project with many colleagues, and we've published over 150 papers doing climate modeling, indoor research on marine cloud brightening and stratospheric aerosols. But these other problems, which are the important ones, we still have to address.
Thank you very much, Alan. And from the University of Cape Town, although he's much closer than that today, Bruce Hewitson. Bruce, tell us a little bit about yourself and your research.
Thank you, yes. I'll start with some fairly raw facts about myself and then go on to what I think is more interesting. So I've lived in Africa all my life, apart from 4 years that I spent at Penn State, where I did my graduate degree. In Africa, my focus has been on doing research for Africa, and particularly around the risk exposures and the vulnerabilities that the science can inform. And that's been a big focus, and we've been running a research center at the University of Cape Town now for 30 years. It's the longest named research center at the university, for what measure that might be. But more interestingly is my engagement in the international sphere, where I've been a coordinating lead author in the IPCC for 4 assessment cycles, which was a painful process, but really taught a lot, and that exposed me to a diversity of thoughts that I hadn't had before. And I currently co-chair the World Climate Research Programme's core project on regional information for society, which fits right in with this idea of, if we want to do climate intervention, what is the epistemic basis on which we are making our decisions? And so in that context of this panel, my framing is rooted in the lived experience of the Global South, which means I might say some things that are unusual to many of you. And I like to draw a distinction of awareness and comprehension. We had a near day zero drought in my city a few years ago where we almost ran out of water. The city was all aware of the problem, but only half the city comprehended the problem enough to actually act in terms of reducing their water consumption. And this difference between awareness and comprehension makes a big impact when we start talking about the ethics of how we approach the decisions for climate intervention. We're aware of the facts, but comprehending the lived experience is something else. And we know that we're pushing past the 1.5 global warming target. There's pretty much no chance we're going to hit that. We've pledges on the table to take us to about 2.5, but we've not been hitting those pledges. And so we live with a commitment to a future that is really concerning. And in Africa, we are particularly worried because we live with systemic fragility. Small changes can push the system into a dysfunctional state. And climate intervention could be one of those small changes. And so I speak from that perspective of systemic fragility and how do we ethically engage with the climate intervention actions that could have far-reaching consequences into the 80% that live in the Global South.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And last but not least, Clara Botto, Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. And I have to point out, Clara's wearing the best shoes ever. They have planets on them. So if you get a chance to chat with her afterwards, check out the shoes. Clara?
Thank you so much for having me here. The organization I work with, I know it's a huge name, but DSG is the acronym, so I'll refer to the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering as DSG, where I'm proud to be the Director of Outreach, and I know that outreach is it's a small but big word as well, but that means that I'm dealing with different climate vulnerable communities from the Arctic to the Pacific who are not yet part of the decision-making tables on climate intervention or solar geoengineering. And that's what we do. And I guess to introduce myself, I think it's interesting to know how I got into this space. So I was already working with different climate justice groups for the past 10 years. And 5 years ago, I ended up in a climate engineering conference, and I had no idea what that was. And it really shocked me to see that no one in the climate justice movements that I was part of knew what climate intervention was. And it really worried me that we were super disconnected from the scientific community. And so that was my entry point, and already with a lot of concerns for who would be driving the conversations on these technologies, who was funding the research, and what was the motivation of scientists to do their work on this. And these are concerns that I still have, but I think that if we're not talking about it, we're actively deciding not to be engaged in the conversation. And so a couple of years ago, I started working with C2G, that was the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, on a one-year program that they had to involve young people in this discussion. And then that led me to different spaces, like following the Marine Cloud Brightening experiment in Australia, to being with Arctic communities who are also integrating this space. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Clara. Well, let me start with some questions to our panelists. And if anybody in our colleagues, Nana and Marion on screen, if you want to comment on any of these, please speak up, and I'll make sure that you're recognized. Margaret, I'm going to start with you. So you've been working on climate intervention, research ethics for quite a while now. You have a lot of experience in this. How have you seen the scientific and ethics community come together over time? And do you think that now might be the point where the research community is ready to embrace the sort of ethical framework that's been put forward?
Well, first I want to clarify that I haven't been working on the ethics of climate intervention. I've been trying to stimulate people to work on the ethics of climate intervention. I think that people have been talking about this and acknowledging the need for ethical behavior, for climate justice, et cetera, for a long time. But basically, we had communities who didn't know each other. And so it's great to say, oh yes, I want to behave ethically, but if I don't know who to involve in my project in order to ensure that I am planning it ethically, conducting it ethically, assessing it ethically, I'm not going to do the best job. And I think that what we've seen now is a decade of conversation that really has been accelerated by the process that AGU went through about the importance of engaging. And in the process of doing that, kind of unveiling the communities to each other. So now, I know the people that were on that great group of 60 people and which ones were ethicists, and I can tell people, oh, you might call this person or that person. So I think the other backdrop for this is what's been happening in the broader conversation around climate and climate justice. And that's also there with, for example, overfishing or plastic pollution or other pollution and justice. And it has raised the visibility of these questions, the importance of these questions, and drawn the communities together. And I think that that puts us in a position now where people have the tools to engage in the discussion much more aggressively and much more effectively than they have before. But I think we still need to engage. It isn't all happening yet.
Right. Well, thank you for that, Margaret. And hopefully discussions like this can help move the issue forward. And I know AGU's goal is to have an ongoing effort to bring this to the attention of the scientific community and encourage adoption as much as possible. This isn't going to be one of those reports that we do and put on a shelf. So hopefully with all of you helping, I know we can be successful. I'm going to turn to Alan. How do you think, Alan, funding bodies, both public, private, I know we have foundations investing in this, the public sector has also been curious and is funding research in all of this. How can those funders influence the ethical conduct of scientists who are engaging in this? And how can we incentivize them to perhaps include it in their funding decisions?
As I told you before, I don't really know the answer to this question.
I told you I was going to ask it anyway.
First of all, we have to be ethical in everything we do. Climate intervention research isn't that different from many other things that we all do. And so we already behave ethically and we have get funded. And so it's not that special, except in one area. When you talk about research, I work on stratospheric aerosol research. I've worked on volcanic eruptions my whole career. The difference is between indoor and outdoor research. So I do indoor research. I run climate models and look at the impacts of various injection strategies on food, on drought, on all the impacts of climate change. If something goes wrong with my model, you just fix the bug and run it again. Nothing bad happens. And I don't think there should be ethical judgment or control on how people think, what volcanoes they study, what climate models they run. Nobody knows what code you're running. So that's quite different from outdoor research, which would involve injecting something into the atmosphere, either injecting particles into clouds and from the viewpoint of oceans and putting iron in the oceans, or putting something into the stratosphere. And for that, we worry about the pollution aspects. So how much do you put in? What would be the impacts? And if you're going to do an outdoor experiment, I think there has to be a really good scientific question that justifies that experiment. AGU has a policy statement on climate intervention research, which was published a couple years ago. And in there it says, a robust research program requires outdoor research. And I don't agree with that. I think we can, for example, study nuclear weapons without doing any more outdoor research. And so our new ethical statement, I think, doesn't really quite agree with that. You need a good scientific reason to do it, and a question that can't be answered with indoor research. Attempts to do outdoor research, like the ScopeX experiment, where the group from Harvard was going to fly a balloon up into the stratosphere, emit a tiny amount of stuff that wouldn't hurt anybody, or the marine cloud brightening people who were spraying stuff off an aircraft carrier in San Francisco Bay, have both been shut down because the public doesn't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it. So to do a good outdoor experiment, you need to, first of all, have some mechanism to evaluate the impacts, and also some education of people why you're doing it and why it's important.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan. I appreciate that. Let me turn to Clara. One of the tenets of the ethical framework is to give impacted communities a voice in the decision-making, in the design of the research, even as scientists start to think about it, to bring in outside voices. How is your work helping make that happen?
I think the points that Alan just brought up are things that we are actively working on. So we need to educate people before we want them to be engaged in this discussion. And like you mentioned as well, fieldworks that were previously shut down, it happened precisely because the local communities were not involved. And we can see that other fieldworks that are also happening for the past years, they're doing active work with the local community. So I guess that explains why the work is still ongoing, like in Australia or up in the Arctic with sea ice thickening. So that's one of our biggest activities, is really bringing this information to the impacted communities and to the broader climate community as well, because even though we're here at the main stage of AGU, we're still very much a bubble, and even, you know, UN staff and other big climate organizations, they're not yet part of this. So that's something that we really want to foster. And I guess another huge chunk of my work specifically is to bring this information to the younger generations, which goes from scientists to early career professionals, which will be making decisions on this topic in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And I guess the sooner they start to understand and really be empowered. I know this word empowered has lost its meaning somehow because we've been using it a lot, but I guess it still holds some value that if they really understand what they're talking about, they will be empowered to make better decisions in the coming years if they end up being decision makers or not. And in the latest EU Commission's report that you just mentioned that came out yesterday, they have, for example, one of their recommendations is to have citizens' assemblies to discuss geoengineering. And that's something we've also been working on. How can we bring citizens who aren't even working on climate to this space? Because we know everyone will be impacted, it's just not people who work with climate.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Clara. Let me reach out to Nana in Ghana. Your research focuses on climate modeling and climate impact assessments on society. So can you share your perspective on bringing this kind of code of conduct forward and what it could do for your work, what its impact would be, and how it might affect the communities that you work with.
Thank you. I think the whole essence of doing climate research is to understand the impact it will have on, or changes in the climate will have on the people and the livelihood health of the people. So bringing in the perspective of climate intervention, in the modeling, we try to understand how these, I particularly focus on solar radiation modification modeling. How is that affecting the climate system, especially the climate impact drivers? We're looking at flooding, we're looking at drought, we're looking at every other variable in the atmosphere that defines the climate system. We want to understand how that will change, or things will change, if we actually deploy climate interventions. So for me, it's more about what I do every day, understanding the climate system and the impact it has on the society, on the people. So it's in line with my research, and I believe that with all of these interventions, we are encouraging research, and if these climate interventions are potential solutions for cooling the earth quickly or immediately, we also want to understand how it will affect the climate and eventually affect people, or livelihood or health of the people as well. Yeah, thank you.
That's great, Nana. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Marion while I'm looking at the screen here. You bring something very special and important to this conversation as an ethicist. What lessons can we learn about past effort to bring ethics into the conversation of perhaps other technological advances or interventions in other fields that we could apply to climate intervention? I know you've given this a lot of thought, and I'd love it if you could give us a bit of perspective and context on that.
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think sort of to think about the big context, over the last 30 or 40 years maybe, there's been increasing attention to the interplay between science and social values, and to the importance of developing technologies in ways that are socially responsive and socially informed. So I think there's been a bit of a shift from a kind of a simple pipeline model of science and technology development, where scientists sort of do the research, produce the technology, and then hand it over to society to determine how to use that technology. There's been a much more emphasis on sort of an integrated approach and upstream engagement with various publics in order to shape the kinds of questions we ask, the kind of variables we look at, and the kinds of technologies that are actually developed. So to give you asked about sort of specific examples that might be relevant to this case, so I just want to mention two. Here in the US, I think one important development was the LC program, the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomics research program, which was initiated in 1990 in association with the Human Genome Project, but then was later institutionalized as the LC research program under the broad auspices of the National Human Genome Research Institute under the NIH, National Institutes of Health. And I think, this program was important because it demonstrated or stressed the value of multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research in understanding the social and ethical dimensions of emerging technologies and technological developments. And this is actually something that's also highlighted in the climate intervention space. So for example, the 2021 National Academy's report, the Reflecting Sunlight report, really emphasize the importance of a multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research program. And I think many reports have stressed, and Alan Robach, I think, mentioned this as well, that the ethical and governance dimensions of climate intervention may be just as important as the scientific and technical ones, and that there's interplay between these. The other example that I wanted to mention relates to inclusive and co-produced research related to disability and accessibility. In the research community around disability and accessibility, there have been collaborations between people with disabilities, social scientists, engineers, philosophers, and others to develop technologies that best serve the diverse needs of users. And those approaches have engaged prospective users really from the outset. So I think this illustrates, in relation to climate intervention, the value of engaging multiple publics and stakeholders and recognizing the diversity within stakeholder communities. Also the importance of empowering historically marginalized communities and paying particular attention to, I mean, in the case of climate intervention, to inequities in research capacities globally, which I think is an important factor in this area. So, I guess with respect to climate intervention, I think it's important to think about multiple forms of engagement at different scales and involving different communities. And this can have substantive impacts on how research proceeds, as well as shape greater attention to engagement processes, questions of who should be involved and how.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marion. I'd like to turn to Bruce. Bruce, I know you work globally. You're a recognized global expert on all of these issues, but I know you're also extremely sensitive to some of the regional issues that surround this, and when it comes to funding, when it comes to the necessary knowledge that occurs at varying rates in different parts of the world. I wonder how and whether the framework might help, and whether it could close some of those gaps that you've identified for us during your career.
Thanks. I mean, a framework is essential if you want to start talking about an ethical approach to things. But I want to start with the tension that exists between an ethical framework and the pragmatism that happens in the decision process when you try and implement something. Decisions are very often designed around a cost-benefit framework. A cost-benefit framework can dehumanize people groups. It can marginalize people groups because the decision process is not about individuals, it's about what's the cost-benefit. Ethical frameworks are about people. Ethical frameworks are how you respect people groups. And we live in a world of a great heterogeneity of ethical systems and value systems. Now, we have a problem here. We have both the tension between the cost-benefit decision process and the ethical frameworks, but we also have a problem that the ethical frameworks are very often designed from the global north perspective. And so we have a perspective issue here. It's the strongest voice is from the global north. And yes, there's consultation with the global south, but the voice of the global south not strongly implemented or engaged in when it comes to that. So when we speak about inclusive participation, what do we do about the global 80% in the South? What do we do about the fact in a nation 40% of the population may be unemployed? How do you bring their value perspectives into the ethical framework, which hopefully will frame and contain the decision process? And so we have issues like climate literacy. Now, I don't know how you define climate literacy. I define climate literacy as across a web of actors. It's not just scientists to society. It's about saying, do I know enough about your context that I can ask an intelligent question? And we need to build climate literacy around climate intervention, because most people have a very shallow understanding of what climate intervention is, and a perception is, well, let's do X and we'll get Y and all the problem is solved. And we know as scientists that is far from the truth. So what question should we ask? And I think this raises a key question of what is robust information. Climate intervention is an adaptation mechanism. Adaptation is about adapting to something which is predicated on information that you think is robust. Now, I don't know what your definition of robust is, but I would say robust, putting on some conversations with Wendy Parker, who's a philosopher here in Virginia, is thinking about what is resilient to the remaining uncertainty. So if your information is resilient to the remaining uncertainty, then you can have a degree of robustness about how we act on that. But there are dangers around here. We have a danger of presuming our information is robust because we do not have a common framework within the scientific community to assess and evaluate what is robust for decision making. There is no framework out there for making that assessment. You can find exceptions in case studies and projects, but there's no community-wide approach to assessing what is robust. And I would invite you to engage with me on this because we are leading a major program around this. Then we have the presumption of climate literacy, which I've mentioned already. We have a presumption that we behave ethically. As scientists, we believe that we're behaving ethically. One of the factors of ethics that I wrote in a paper is humility, transparency, and honesty. Yes, I think as scientists, we're all honest. Scientists are not typically humble, and very often scientists are not transparent. So there are some fundamental issues there of perceptions of ourselves when we come into this. And this presumption of transparency is absolutely critical. Being transparent about the limits of our science and the limits of the actionability around that. Now, I want to put this in the context of power relationships. I ran a survey recently where we looked at the factors that go into making robust information, and we polled some stakeholder decision makers in the global south, and just this last week we polled a bunch of scientists from the global north. The results of what goes into making a robust information for decision were completely different. What they considered as priority. There was a presumption that, oh, yes, of course, everybody agrees that this is priority, but there was a huge diversity of what is priority. So there are conversations that are missing in the ethical framework. Ethical framework is ideals, and we need it, but we need to see what flows from the ethical frameworks. And I'd like to suggest three things that I think an ethical framework, and the ethical framework we're talking about, needs to instigate in new developments that flow from that. The one is building a true comprehension of the risk exposure, particularly of the most vulnerable. We like to think, oh, Africa's vulnerable, South America's vulnerable, wherever you want to pick up. But do you comprehend it? Going back to my earlier remarks about awareness and comprehension. What is the risk exposure that they truly face under a systemic fragility of their society? Secondly, we need to build capacity and explore and understand the consequential risk exposure from our decisions. The capacity has to be rooted in localized knowledge. It's not enough to parachute in a set of experts from another region because they don't understand the contextual localized knowledge of the risk exposure. So this requires a disaggregated activity that brings in from the bottom up rather than just proceeds from the top down. And then we need to approach this idea of what is robust information. If we were going to do climate intervention, we do some modeling experiments or we do some real world experiments. How do we extrapolate those to the second order effects, third order effects? How do we know when the information and understanding of the consequences is strong enough to say we can actually do something? I'll close with this comment that I learned from Nancy Twane, who's a philosopher at Penn State. And she coined the phrase an ethical epistemic problem. It's not just about an ethical framework. We have an ethical epistemic problem. In other words, it's a knowledge problem as well as an ethical framing problem. And we can't separate the two. We need to bring them together, especially in a time now that we live in polycrises. Climate change is the biggest threat. We're on target to a destructive future at this point. We need to bring these things together in a transdisciplinary framing and not just think we can silo our activities separately. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's extremely thoughtful. Alan, I know you had wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, when Margaret introduced the Asilomar conference, the first thing she said was, I don't want to be here. And I'd just like to echo that. We know the solution to global warming is to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. We know that it's mitigation, as Brandon said when he introduced this panel. And so I just want to make clear that we're not here to advocate climate intervention at all. We're here to quantify the potential risks of doing it if sometime in the future you could. The technology doesn't exist, so maybe in a decade or more. And the risks of not doing it. We have to compare the risks and the risks. And the sooner we know that, the sooner we can move on. And if it turns out it's going to be too risky, if there are ethical problems or governance problems that won't be able to be solved, we should then push much harder on mitigation, on running the world on the sun and the wind. At the Silomar conference, which was held at the same place where a genetics engineering conference had been held earlier to look at ethics, that was part of the symbolism, Professor Rob Sokolow from Princeton University went around and took a survey during that week, and on Friday he reported his results. The question was, what's the worst thing that could happen if we did climate intervention? And well, we called it geoengineering back then, but now we call it climate intervention. And the answer was global nuclear war. Countries couldn't agree on what climate they wanted, or they couldn't agree that some other country was changing the climate to help them, but not this country. And because of chaos in the climate system, we might never be able to attribute extremes of climate to whether we do geoengineering or not. So I think there's maybe some problems that we'll never be able to solve, and the sooner we can agree on that, the sooner we can get on with more mitigation.
Thank you very much, Alan. Very provocative. And I know, while Bruce was speaking, I saw Marion online nodding and sort of offering her support for what he was saying. Is there anything you'd like to add to this discussion?
I mean, not really. I just think the importance, I think the distinction between awareness and comprehension was really critical. And I think Bruce's emphasis of this idea of systemic fragility. And I do think that as researchers, those of us who are researchers in the global north in wealthy nations, sometimes implicitly are likely to assume that we, in some sense, like those of us who live in wealthy global north countries with a lot of research capacity and a lot of political power, will be the ones who are likely to control these technologies. And I think there's just a really different kind of positionality and feeling to being in a situation where that assumption probably doesn't hold, and that's actually one of the things that I think some of the social science research on this topic has revealed, is that, one of the biggest concerns that folks in climate vulnerable communities have is not just about like disparate regional impacts and how those may be significant for them with respect to climate intervention, but also a worry about sort of further deprivation of agency and power and control, and having somebody else control the climate globally, I think is something that's concerning. So I just wanted to underscore the kinds of points that Bruce is raising.
It's great. Thank you so much, Marion. Let's turn our attention to some of the policy-making bodies that are involved in these topics. We just finished COP29, sponsored by the United Nations. There are many different parts of the UN that have looked at these issues, talked about climate interventions. Where do you all see, and do you all see any hope, frankly, for these international policy-making bodies actually adopting something like this that could impact research and scientific research around the world and avoid some of these issues that Marion and Bruce and Alan have raised just now? Margaret looks ready.
Well, I think that what the UN ultimately does is provide a venue, an intellectual venue for the discussions. There are very few places where any UN body exercises governance. But they do exercise the role of negotiation. And that's certainly true for the Convention on biological diversity or desertification or climate, but even in some of the more technical bodies like the International Maritime Organization, which sets the negotiating framework for things like emissions of gases from global marine operation. It also weighed in on the issue of adding anything to the ocean as a climate intervention, whether that was alkalinity or whether that was iron or whatever. But there aren't any IMO police out there in terms of governance. But that role of negotiation is important, and I think the UN is important in that regard because everybody is required to have a voice.
Yes.
And so it is a place where, and it's a place where the less developed countries or the global south have had experience in raising issues. I'm not saying that everything's perfect. It's just that if you have something that's totally new cloth, and nobody quite knows what the social ground rules are for the negotiation. That's not true in the UN.
Right.
And I think that that is its most valuable role for us. And once they decided on some rules, then I think we have the issue of how are those rules enforced.
Enforcement, yeah. Yeah, Nana, can I turn to you for this as well? I know you are heavily involved as a leader in the IPCC. Can you talk a little bit about your perception about the UN system and how it might be helpful in this situation or not helpful?
Yeah, thank you. I know that a lot of the COP or the UNFCCC discussions and negotiations are based on the IPCC reports. So the IPCC reports have formed very major decisions within the globe or through the UNFCCC. So let me use the state assessment report informing the global stock take. I need to also let the audience know that the IPCC is considering topics on climate interventions in the 7th assessment cycle. So there's carbon dioxide removal mentioned, there's solar radiation modification, there are other interventions mentioned, and at the moment there is scoping meeting ongoing for the 7th assessment report. And these topics are going to appear in the IPCC report. The worrying trend is that once it appears, most of the global decisions through the UNFCCC are going to be based on the report. And where we have these climate interventions there, it means that there's going to be either encouraging research or not encouraging research. However, the assessment will come out, will depend. The UNFCCC decisions or negotiation will depend on the assessment report that the IPCC will come out with. The worrying trend is that the climate intervention is new in Africa, or let's say global south. It's relatively new, and there are only a few scientists that are involved. We have limited knowledge in it, as Bruce mentioned earlier on. So we need to understand, we need more research in the global south, especially if IPCC is going to have assessment in this area. We need materials for assessment. There's limited interest because we have limited understanding, and the idea of climate intervention is not widespread in the global south. We even don't have expertise at all for outdoor experiments if you have to do it. Even with the indoor, there are limited expertise, limited resources for that. So once there's a call for literature in this area, we're still going to have limited literature or materials coming from global south. We're going to get enough information, probably a good amount of information from global north, But then, once it appears as a report in the IPCC, the UNFCCC is going to have negotiation on it. And some regions, or probably the Global South, will be, I would say, lacking behind because we don't have much information on it. I will only encourage more research, especially in the Global South, on the climate interventions. So UNFCCC, at the last COP, this was also a discussion. Many side events had the climate intervention discussions, either as research output or discussion generally in the different aspects of climate intervention. So it's a growing discussion, as you rightly said in your introduction, and we have to involve all or every part of the globe in this kind of conversation, because the UNFCCC will probably, or one day soon, will come up with this in their negotiations with different parties.
That's great.
Thank
you, Nana. That's very helpful. And Bruce, and then I'm gonna, good, Clara, both of you, terrific.
Just a quick comment to follow on that. I think we have a finite time window in which to get these UN structures, policies, treaties right. Because when climate change impacts reach a crisis threshold, action is going to be taken, and they are not going to have the teeth to respond to it. So we have a small window of time now to get it right. And my worry is the IPCC next assessment report is coming very late in that window.
Yeah.
I would just add that one of the biggest powers the UN has is its convening power. It can bring all countries together in the same room, but that does not mean that they're well aware of what they're supposed to negotiate. It's not in the negotiating agenda for the UNFCCC yet, because the countries haven't brought it up, but it's been in other UN bodies, like the UN Environment Program, UNEP. But we could clearly see at the last UNEA, the last UN Environment Assembly, the knowledge gaps that some countries face, not only knowledge, but also capacity issues, that for countries that only have one negotiator for climate, for example, they can't be in 3 rooms at the same time that are having climate discussions. So there's this capacity issue and also the knowledge issue, because some countries didn't know what SRM was, for example, even though they were supposed to negotiate on that. So I would just like to bring it up that having the UN embracing this conversation does not mean that the countries are able to contribute to it as well. So we have a lot of work still to be done on that part as well, which is how Bruce was talking about climate literacy.
That's great. Important point, Clara. Thank you. We've talked about solar radiation modification. That's the one that seems to get the headlines, at least recently, in terms of projects and efforts that have been started and perhaps not completed. But I would like to turn to CDR, carbon dioxide removal, and particularly marine CDR. That has received some attention from policymakers. And as the developments in that area move forward, are there concerns and are there opportunities to really make this work and have it make a difference as we deal with global warming and climate change? I'll turn to Margaret for that one.
Well, I think that one of the things, the communities that look at climate intervention are separated. And one of the ones that we don't talk very much about is the whole community that's looking at CDR related to agriculture. And that is a very vibrant community. And there are, for example, already projects looking at genetically modified plants that express suberin, so their roots are much more cork-like, so their root mass is 2 or 3 times the size of non-altered plants. It changes the entire soil structure. It probably changes the soil microbiome, and there are active experiments going on. And in others, there are active experiments with the idea of grinding up olivine and putting it on farm fields to enhance its alteration. And as it weathers, it takes up CO2. So there is a whole community out there doing that. And what they are doing, how they're handling the ethical questions is opaque to us. And I think that one of the things that I worry about is this segmentation and the idea that each community says, oh, what we're doing is the most appropriate thing to do because, oh, we all do agriculture and so that's easy and whatever. Or solar radiation modification would be much more easy to do than marine carbon dioxide removal. It wouldn't be upsetting the ecosystem in the ocean. And then the ocean people are saying, but this addresses carbon while solar radiation management doesn't. And I think we have to stop letting the community sort of get away with, my thing is best, and say that we really need to look at this in a much more comprehensive fashion. And that and start looking at more of those externalities, like okay, it's true, we all do agriculture, and maybe it seems less invasive, but we aren't holding all of the communities to the same standards about looking at life cycle, scalability, cost, other social dimensions of this. And so rather than looking at one or the other, I think that it's important that we start looking at them as a portfolio.
Interesting. That's great. Any other thoughts on that question? Online, Marion, Nana?
I want to answer the next one.
You want to answer the next one? Now they can predict the future. This is an impressive panel. We have been talking some about solar radiation modification. There's funding going into it from foundations, from some of at least the billionaires in the US have been attracted to this. And it's also attracted additional public attention that our colleagues here have mentioned. Alan, do you want to go ahead and provide a summary of where things stand with SRM? And should we or should we not be worried about it? I think we've heard some of the concerns, certainly the communities that have been close to, geographically, physically, some of these outdoor experiments have expressed their concerns. What does that mean for the future of this, even though there's money being poured into it?
Okay, I'd like to address several reasons why the public should not be concerned.
Okay.
First of all, you should not be concerned about chemtrails. The government isn't spraying a cloud up in the atmosphere to try and control people. Those are just condensation trails from airplanes, and we can predict them. I went to a AAAS meeting where there were all these protesters outside, chemtrail protesters, and I went out, David Key said, go out and talk to them, explain to them what we're doing, but they're sort of dissipated over time. Another thing we should not be concerned about is making sunsets. This is two guys who have a business where if you send them money, they'll put some sulfur in a balloon and send it up and claim that it's causing a reduction of global warming. It's on a scale many, many orders of magnitude below what would have any impact, and they're just doing it as a business. I was in California Berkeley last year, and they were doing a demonstration in Balboa Park, so I went and met them, and they were talking about how much money is coming in each month, how much is going out, and they said, here's a balloon full of sulfur, do you want to launch it? I said, no, I don't want to touch that, but that's just sort of a distraction, but they're the only people that are doing it, so they've gotten a lot of attention from 60 Minutes and in the New York Times. Another reason why we should not be concerned is people say, if you do research, it's a slippery slope to deployment. The more research you do, the more the chances are that it will actually take place and that it's a bad thing. So first of all, we don't know whether it's worse doing it or not. But second of all, I think it might be a sticky slope. I think the more research we do, the less likely we might be to use it. But that's why we have to do research, to quantify the potential risks and benefits.
Thank you, Alan. Any other thoughts on that? Yes, Bruce.
Sorry, I always have thoughts. I guess the reason to be concerned, that concerns me, is not about the technology of SRM. I think there are enough technological ideas out there that something can be viable. What worries me is about the sustainability of it and the climate shock for when you stop it. I don't think that's adequately addressed in terms of the governance and policy structures around that. And I'm worried about the sort of teleconnection linkages within the climate system of doing SRM in one locality and what are the trickle-down consequences, second-order effects around there. These are things that I think are amenable to research, but we need to bring them, I think, a bit more central to the research agenda.
Termination shock was one of the things on my list, and
I missed that, sorry.
Some of our models experiments stop it, and you get rapid warming at a rate much faster than you would have gotten if you hadn't done anything, and it's much harder to adapt to that.
Yeah.
Great. Any other thoughts on this? Nana, Marion?
Oh, I mean, I can chime in briefly. Nana, do you want to go?
No, I think it's what I have in mind is already mentioned. We need to consider the costs or the risk of not doing it as well. And as Bruce says, when do we stop and how do we do this? So we need to look at this intervention holistically and look at every aspect of it in research before we do deployment. Yeah.
Could I just mention, at the Asilomar conference, John Shepard drew the famous napkin diagram. He drew a diagram of global warming, and if we do some mitigation, we'll still get less warming, and if we do some CDR, we'll get less, but it still might be too warm to be acceptable. So we should do some SRM to shave off the peak of the warming, so to keep it, say, 2 degrees above pre-industrial. But he labeled the axes of his diagram, and the time period that he said we should do SRM for was 150 years. And so is something like that ever sustainable? Do we really have to live with that? And if that's not something we can live with, maybe we'll have some magical source of energy like fusion that'll be cheap and we'll be able to use it much before that. But that's sort of the thing. Were you the one that interviewed Elon Musk at
I was.
Yeah, so there was a plenary at an AGU meeting several years ago, and Elon Musk was interviewed by Margaret, and he said fusion is the answer to our energy supply. She said, what? He said, yeah, the sun is run on fusion power, and all we need is solar panels to collect that energy. That's how fusion is going to save the world. So that's one thing I can agree with him on.
There we go. We'll leave Elon Musk out of this discussion going forward, but Marion, did you want to add some thoughts?
Yeah, I think this question of whether the public should be concerned, I think, public should be concerned and they should be engaged. I think this is a technology that would affect everyone and all ecosystems on the planet, and our understanding is fairly limited still with respect to ecological impacts and regional impacts. as others have highlighted, this is a technology that's generally, I mean, if we're talking about SRM, generally envisioned as a multi-decade long enterprise. So it's a multi-generational endeavor, and there would be a need for coordinated long-term planning. It's also the case that there are major inequities, as others have highlighted, in knowledge development, research capacity, power in relation to governance and deployment capacity. And so there's a lot to think about. And I think more engagement by various publics in thinking these things through and raising questions and issues for the research community to take up is going to be valuable.
That's great. Thank you, Marion. I want to talk about the theme of this conference, and that's what's next for science. But this session is focused on climate intervention research. What do you all, look into your crystal balls for me and tell me what's next. Maybe 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I'm not going to ask you to do 150 years, Alan. That's probably too much. But is there a path forward that you see? And I would love to hear all of you talk about your vision for the next several years on this topic, and whether or not we can actually make this happen in an ethically grounded way with providing the knowledge to the impacted communities that is so necessary. Who wants to go first? Whose crystal ball has been polished?
Maybe I can start. Also tying it to the previous question of what concerns me, and then I guess that's also for the future of science, is why are we having these discussions in the first place? I think in lots of the rooms I find myself in, we're just talking about the technology itself and the challenges to make the technology feasible and the costs and all this. And we end up forgetting why we're talking about this in the first place, because it's just not about temperatures. It's about people and ecosystems and lives that might or might not be lost. And I think if we're not bringing the narratives discussion into the futures that we want, we're kind of missing out on why we're here in the first place. And I guess I really hope that we can open our eyes to new futures that we're not exploring yet, where nature is in the center of the discussion and technology is not. It's not this God that we're worshiping. It's just a way to preserve the nature that we have been losing for the past decades and century. And I hope that we can make that our compass for all the science discussions that we have.
I think we're moving in that direction. There's going to be a conference in Cape Town in May next year, a global forum on climate intervention, and it's going to have some scientists talking about the technical issues, but it's going to involve many other people, from governance, from people in the global south, and on ethical considerations. And so I think they're planning on having a couple hundred people there. We're going to have our GeoMet meeting as a side meeting there. And it's funded by the Degrees Initiative, which is funded by the Open Philanthropy Project. And we're having it in the in South Africa because it's much easier for scientists from many countries to get visas to go there than it is to come to the United States. Some of our talks here were canceled because people couldn't get visas. And so I think people are very aware who are doing research on this of the ethical issues, of the inclusion issues, and they're not just trying to see, I don't think there are many people, a few people think this is going to be cool, we're going to do it soon, but I don't think many people are thinking that way. I think that it will be more open and more people will be involved looking at, but there also needs to be more funding. We need money to look at impacts on ecosystems, on agriculture, on water, not just on temperature.
Thank you, Alan. Bruce.
So I want to strike a slightly negative note on that. I accept both your positions. I think we have to hold out that hope. if the step jump we've seen in global temperatures in the last 2 years is a realistic projection of where we're accelerating into at the moment, impacts are going to magnify rapidly. The pressure is going to increase on climate intervention before I think a lot of the policy frameworks are in place, and people are going to take action. So I foresee increased polarization around that. I think a way forward around that is to start building a conversation around how to see the problem from other perspectives. And a lot of the tensions is because people are taking unilateral actions or unilateral decisions or pushing agendas on a unilateral basis. To get around that is to see a problem from somebody else's perspective and stand in their shoes. And it's not, it's really hard. I use your microphone. It's really hard to do, and it needs a proactive initiative. And one example that we're doing at the moment is working with cities, is we're saying, we want to see the problem as you see the problem, and we're struggling to see that as scientists. So will you run a training course for us? Will you run a skilling workshop for us? And the city management are going to run a skilling workshop for the scientists.
That's great.
Skilling, upskilling, training. No, skilling. S-K-I-L-L-I-N-G. Yeah. Training workshop. How to learn to see the problem as a city manager sees the problem. Because scientists are really poor at doing that. And it's the same in this context. We need to see the SRM, the CDR, the different options that are on the table as other people see them if we want to find a collegiate way forward.
That's great. Thank you very much. Margaret, what do you think?
Well, I want to go back to, I think Clara's intervention was more a challenge for us to think about not just the technology, but living sustainably with the planet. And I think that the sooner we start looking at the entire system and looking at what is the least that we can manage to change through intervention. And then again, not sort of pit one kind of intervention against another, but see whether there are, Rob Sokolow, you of interventions of that sort that we can make to at least minimize, if not avoid this. I know that we're all afraid of exactly what you were talking about, Bruce, with changes that come so fast that people feel that they have to take some kind of emergency intervention. But I think that and it's sort of the AGU idea of thriving Earth exchange and the systemic approach and all of those factors, as opposed to just looking at it from a narrow technological point of view with individual technologies.
Yeah, looking at the big picture. Thank you, Margaret. Nana, could you give us your views?
Yeah, thank you. I think in the next couple of years, our goal should be to advance our understanding of the climate interventions as a potential component of comprehensive climate action, whilst we have to prevent premature or poorly governed deployment that could have this proportionate impact on vulnerable regions. So doing this will require establishing clear international protocols for research oversight, impact assessment, stakeholder engagement as well. And we need to pay particular attention to regions or countries that are already vulnerable to climate impacts. So I feel in the next few years, that's the way we should go. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana. And it may be very appropriate, since what triggered this session was an ethical framework for climate intervention, that we wrap it up with an ethicist. Marion, do you want to give us your thoughts on what things look like going forward?
Or no pressure, right?
No pressure at all.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to echo what many of the others have said. I mean, I think at this moment, I do actually feel somewhat optimistic about where we've come, because I remember, 10 or 12 years ago being in a conversation where some folks were saying, why do we even need ethics at all? Like, why, like this is, we have all the ethics we need. Why are we even having further ethics conversations in relation to climate intervention? And I think we're past that point now. I think there's much wider recognition of the social and ethical dimensions of climate intervention, and many, broadening efforts to diversify the research community, diversify the engagement of people from many parts of the world, even though we have a long ways to go. But I do think some of the concerns Bruce raised are important, and I think it would be valuable at this point to have a conversation around anticipatory governance and what steps we can take now to avoid some of the worst forms of deployment, like deployments that would be non-deliberative or uninformed or uncoordinated. And to get some pieces in place to guard against those worst outcomes, even as we're also thinking about how to steer towards some of the better ways of developing and researching these technologies in a way that's ethical and inclusive. And then lastly, I think looking at the whole system is really critical, thinking about how research and development and governance on this topic might intersect with negotiations about climate change more generally and responses to climate change. So I think we have to think about not just the physical climate, but also the ethical climate and the potential to build or undermine sustainability through our work on these topics.
That's great. Thank you. I just want to say, as we close out, how incredibly impressed I am with the thoughtfulness of our panel, people who were willing to give us their honest opinion about this. And I also think that it's important to acknowledge, and I'm only a little bit biased because I work there, that AGU may have been not only the best organization to pull a community together to develop an ethical framework, but maybe the only organization that could have done it at this moment in time. It was driven by an incredibly talented and dedicated staff team, but it was the product of a global group of advisors who gave it their best, gave it their all, contributors from all parts of the world, not only Earth and space scientists, but the science community writ large, community activists, people who are policy makers, ethicists, people in public health. And I want to thank everyone who has touched this over the last few years. And just to let you know, your work's not over. So we'll be in touch. So please join me in thanking this incredibly talented panel.